Good morning. It's good morning and good good Sunday morning for people in our part of the world, in the Philippines, and a good evening to people in the Western Hemisphere, our colleagues from the US and Canada and the rest of the Americas. Okay, so today we have the REC 14, which is on education, media, museology, and indigenous knowledge. I am Ben Vallejo Jr., your co-host, and together with Dean Det Abrera of the CSSP in UP Diliman, we will be also a co-moderator in this, and she will also present the paper. Now, we have three speakers for today. Unfortunately, one of our speakers won't be able to deliver her talk because she is just coming out of quarantine. Right? I know this is a very trying time for us. Myself just came out from quarantine today. So without further ado, our first speaker is Dean Maria Bernadette L. Abrera from the College of Social Science and Philosophy. And like in our collection of papers that we presented today, most of them will do with indigenous knowledge. And so first in this presentation on indigenous knowledge is Dean Abrera's presentation on ritual and indigenous culture in the creation of the nation. We will have two speakers first, then we'll have a 10-minute question and answer, after which for both speakers. And then we will have the next set of speakers later on. Okay, so may I ask Dean Abrera to share her screen? Oh, she's not yet there. Okay. Okay, while we wait for Dean Abrera to come back, okay, for questions, oh, there she is. So Dean, can you share your screen? Good morning.
Good morning. Okay. Good morning and thank you very much. I am excited to be part of APAMS. This is my first academic engagement with PASE, and I hope there will be more of us from okay. From the social sciences who will be part of PASE. My presentation this morning is entitled Ritual and Culture in the Creation of the Nation. As you know, we are all commemorating 500 years of the first contact, among other commemorations this year, the 500 years of first contact between Spanish and Philippine cultures on account of the arrival of Magellan's expedition in 1521. So this commemoration provides us a unique opportunity to revisit this first contact and understand the account of that contact from the Philippine perspective. I will be using a cultural historical method. So, meaning to say, this presentation will cover three major ideas which is the ritual which was interpreted by the Ilustrados in the 19th century as the Pacto de Sangre. The ritual occurred in 1521, and then in 1565, during the Legazpi expedition. So in 1521, it was in Cebu. In 1565, it was in Bohol. And Bohol even maintains the Sanduguan festival. But in the 19th century, there was a new interpretation to the Pacto de Sangre. And this interpretation of the Ilustrados went into a mainstream mode through and it was captured by the Katipunan. But the Katipunan, after taking that reading from the Ilustrados of Pacto de Sangre, reworked the meaning of that event into the pre-colonial significance of the Sandugo. And the Sandugo now became a Katipunan ideology in order to build the nation. Okay, so this is the famous painting of Juan Luna in the 19th century of El Pacto de Sangre. Juan Luna would be among the three major ilustrados who would give that focus and interpretation of the 16th century ritual, which was called by the Spaniards as Pacto de Sangre, but it was a Filipino tradition, it was a Filipino ritual, and it was called Sanduguan or Sandugo. So we are familiar with Sandugo, or meaning to say, literally it means one blood. Okay. Now, the Pacto de Sangre was surfaced in the 19th century among the Ilustrado writings because it was a central idea taken up by the nationalists, foremost of them being Jose Rizal, in the development of a national historical narrative. So it was important for the Ilustrados during their 19th century experiences, especially their experiences of racism in Spain. They had to go back to the pre-colonial period and determine Filipino identity. So the historian and Jesuit John Schumacher pointed out that the 19th century Ilustrados had to go back to the Filipino past because there were malicious insults against them. They were being subjected to a lot of malevolent attacks in print and in person when they were in Spain. So they had to find what that core of Philippine identity and defend it and present themselves as Filipinos coming from a distinct history and a distinct culture. But the historian John Schumacher pointed out that the Ilustrados were overreaching into the colonial past in response to the offensive Spanish attitudes. Now, Rizal would be the most scholarly in his search for pre-Hispanic roots and pre-Hispanic Philippine culture. And he became the most dominant voice in the field. And precisely, he wrote about the Philippine pre-colonial past in the lens of the Filipinos. But it was Juan Luna who visualized the Ilustrado perspective of Pacto de Sangre. And I am still using the Spanish term Pacto de Sangre, because it will be pointed out that primarily they were looking at the events in the 16th century according to 19th century needs and sensibilities, which Schumacher would say would be anachronistic. So that scholarship would awaken the consciousness of the past among Filipinos and would be a foundation for charting the future. Now, the critique of that would be, if we look at this presentation visually of Juan Luna, it it seems to represent the coming together and the equality of two cultures, of two nations. One would be Spain and the other would be the Philippines. This would be the main critique of Schumacher, because at the time when the Pacto de Sangre was undertaken, first by Magellan and second by the important one by Legazpi, the nation that was called the Philippines did not exist. So you can see that eventually there would be many other pacts or many other rituals of Sanduguan that the Spanish had to undergo, because there was not one representative, simply because there was not one nation in existence that could be represented and brought at table for such an agreement. So therefore, this being the critique, the assertion then that the Pacto de Sangre symbolized the nation and symbolized the union between the Philippines and Spain would be erroneous. So it would be a historical misrepresentation, because there was no Philippine nation to represent at that time. It was only small ethnic states. So therefore, the idea of a contract that was brought out by the Ilustrados in the 19th century was ahistorical. So there was no contract, so to speak, between two nations. So this view was being anachronistic. Now, taking off from this critique, we can see that if we actually reread the historical accounts of the Pacto, what came before, especially in 1521, Pigafetta, as the chronicler of the Magellan expedition, he was very meticulous in recording the events that occurred throughout their expedition. And in the first instance, when they arrived, first in Samar, and then they came to Cebu. But here, the line here pertains to their arrival in Samar. So he says, Pigafetta says, when the people had come into this island towards us, immediately the principal one, so it would be the principal would be the Datu or the Raha, that was always their term, the principal. The principal one amongst them went towards the Captain General. The Captain General here is Magellan, with demonstrations of being very joyous at our arrival. So actually, prior to their going to Mactan, it was a very benevolent acceptance from the Filipinos of the arrival of their first contact with the Spaniards. Now, why would, and this is, I think, a factual representation of how the Filipinos really did welcome the foreigners at that time in 1521. Now, how would we explain that celebratory and joyful meeting between the indigenous peoples and the Spanish expeditionaries? Now, because they were even given coconuts, they were given tuba, Pigafetta says it was arak, and then they were given bananas. They came back 4 days after and they were given umay, rice. So they were really being given, provided with food that they that they asked for. And then Humabon of Cebu offered kasing-kasing. So he wanted to be brothers with Magellan. And the events prior to the offer to be a brother to Magellan by Humabon was actually a very physical show of force and strength by the Spaniards, because they kept firing their cannon guns from their vehicle, from their vessels. So from the ships, they would fire it occasionally, especially when they had mass. They would fire it at the during the point of consecration. They would fire the cannons. And the recording was always that Filipinos were so surprised and so fearful of the sound of cannons when they heard it. So after, I think, about 3 instances of cannon fire coming from being heard by, not directed against the Filipinos, but simply being fired. After 3 instances of that, Raha Humabon offered kasing-kasing with Magellan. So to be a brother to Magellan. And that is where they had the sandugo of the Filipinos, pacto de sangre for the Spaniards. And then after that pacto de sangre, there would be another datu, Sula, and he would complain to Magellan that there was somebody from Mactan who would not comply with the orders of providing food for the Spaniards, and that was Lapu-Lapu. So Humabon and Sula were asking for men from the Spaniards in order for them to deal with Lapu-Lapu. And then Magellan himself decided that he would go to Mactan. So we all know afterwards what would happen when Magellan eventually went to Mactan. That is where he would meet his death. But we will not be discussing that. We will be discussing where was this joy and this welcoming attitude coming from. Primarily, there was no experience yet of colonialism, unlike in 1565 when Legazpi was already. It was Legazpi who was offering si Catuna blood brotherhood. He wanted a pacto de sangre with si Catuna, but si Catuna was hesitant about the brotherhood, the blood compact with Legazpi, because they had experience already of what the Portuguese had done, because the Portugal had raided the islands 2 years before the arrival in 1565 of Legazpi. So si Catuna was very hesitant about going into an agreement with the Spaniards, because he equated the Spaniards as being the same as the Portuguese. So after several entreaties from Legazpi that they were not the same as the Portuguese, that was when si Catuna held the Sandugo with Legazpi. So that's the Abueva sculpture in Bohol of the Sandugo. So primarily, the Filipinos in 1521 were joyful and welcoming and even celebratory of the arrival of another group of foreigners, because the Philippine ports, the Philippine areas, were very accustomed to receiving foreign traders. So trade with a foreign state would always mean good a good economic fortune for that trading port, and it would mean a higher form of prestige for that port that would be trading with the foreigner. So that was the reason why, without having any experience yet of what colonialism, Spanish colonialism would be, they were actually welcoming the expedition in 1521. So the political exigency of the Sandugo as a political means of creating alliances would be seen in 1587, because there was already the Sandugo, and yet in 1587, all the chieftains of the Tagalog area, primarily from Tondo, they had what would be called in history as the Tondo conspiracy, the conspiracy of the Maharlikas of Tondo. But it was not simply Tondo, because they were talking to a Japanese trader to supply them with firearms. They were talking to Pampanga and Bulacan datus, to Palawan, and then Sulu, and eventually up to Borneo. They were creating a network, a conspiracy, a network that was plotting the ouster of the Spaniards in Intramuros, because by 1587 they already saw the encroachment of colonialism, and that it was not a simple trading or commercial exchange like what they had experienced previously from all the other Asian traders that had come to the Philippine Islands, from Borneo, for example, from Malaysia, from Champa or Vietnam, from India. They had all been passing through the Philippines and trading, but not one of them had remained in order to conquer. Only the Spanish colonizers. So in just about a decade, they were already plotting that ouster. Now, so meaning to say, the 1521 experience was very different now from the 1587 experience. So therefore, the Pacto de Sangre in the 19th century, as interpreted by the Ilustrados, it became mainstream. But the error in that definition, in the error in the interpretation, was that there were no two nations that were coming into an agreement. But that idea went into the idea of the Katipunan, because the Katipunan, primarily in the essay attributed to Bonifacio, ang dapat mabatid ng mga Tagalog, what the Tagalogs should know, he was referring primarily to the Sandugo, because the Ilustrados had been pointing out that in the Pacto de Sangre, the Spaniards, and this was a reformist view, the Spaniards had reneged on their promise that they would bring about they would bring about better conditions for the country. So that was the Ilustrado perspective, which entered into the Katipunan idea, and as seen in that essay, ang dapat mabatid ng mga Tagalog. So in that essay, it was in the first part of that essay, it was also called Pacto de Sangre, and the idea of Spain reneging on its promise of a better society for the Filipinos was carried in that first part of the essay in the Katipunan. that the Filipinos, the indigenous peoples, underwent this pact together with the Spaniards, with the idea that there would be a better future for them. And then it develops the idea that the Filipinos complied with our promise in that Pacto de Sangre, that we gave them the fullness of abundance. And yet, what did they give us in return? Wala kundi pawang kataksilan ang ganti sa ating pagpapala. So it was really the Ilustrado idea of the Spaniards turning their back on their promise in that Pacto de Sangre. So up to this point, that idea would be carried by the Katipunan. However, the Katipunan would go further from the Ilustrado perspective of a contract that had been reneged by one party, and therefore it was no longer valid as a contract. So that was a very Western perspective of a contract. But the Katipunan would then take it one step further by going back to the indigenous ritual, following the cultural tradition of the Sandugo. The Sandugo as a sacred vow, a sacred union between two persons who would be blood brothers, it is something that you cannot take back. So therefore, the Katipunan would then say, itinuturo ng katwiran, reason would tell us not to hope from the other, from the foreign, but only from ourselves. Ang tayo'y umasa sa ating sarili at huwag antayin sa iba ang ating kabuhayan. So this was really a further step from the Ilustrado perspective of a contract that had been reneged, but this one was already saying that we had to rely on ourselves. We had to hope only on ourselves. Itinuturo ng katwiran, ang tayo'y magkaisang loob, magkaisang isip at akala, because we had our own puri, we had our own dangal, we had our own dignity. So it was already a step towards independence, towards breaking away from Spain, because this Sandugo in the Katipunan would be primarily here. We were no longer entering into a union with the foreign, with the other, with a stranger, but we were entering a union among ourselves as kapatid, as brothers. And it would be, Jacinto would say, it would be the tunay na kapatid, the real brother, with the tunay na ina, with the real mother. And that tunay na ina would be inang bayan. And they would call the brotherhood with the foreign, the brotherhood with the Spaniards, as a huwad na kapatid, a false brotherhood, because Madre España was proved to be not the mother, but it was actually inang bayan. So therefore, in this poem attributed to Bonifacio, who he would say, nasaan ang dugong dapat ibuhos? So he would be going back into the indigenous culture that gave a very central significance to blood as life, blood as oneself. Nasaan ang dugong dapat ibuhos? So nasaan ang dangal ng mga Tagalog, nasaan ang dugong dapat ibuhos? Ipaghandog-handog ang buong pag-ibig hanggang sa may dugo'y ubusing itugis, kung sa pagtatanggol buhay ay kapalit, ito'y kapalaran at tunay na langit. So it was already demanding sacrifice from the Filipinos themselves. So do not put your hope in the other, but it is within the self. So therefore, from Pacto de Sangre, it became the sandugo of the indigenous ritual and the indigenous interpretation, so that it would become an ideology towards independence that was used by the Katipunan. And so therefore, the key ideas here would be the ritual as a historical event underwent interpretations according to different periods in history. It was a pacto de sangre from the Ilustrado interpretation, but from that interpretation, the Katipunan used it and connected it with a deeper cultural tradition among the Filipinos, so that the Sandugo, connecting it with a very deep foundation in Philippine cultural tradition, became the ideology by which independence would finally be attained by the Filipinos. Okay. So thank you very much, and this ends the presentation.
Thank you again, Dean Det Abrera. Okay. I think we can have some questions at the end of her presentation. You can put it in the chat box. So since we are just about a few people now in the Sunday morning, okay, perhaps if anyone wants to ask the question using their microphones, just raise their hand. Okay, again, I'd like to welcome to this session people who just came in. And again, a good Sunday morning for us here, and a good Saturday evening for our colleagues in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, so are there any questions for Dean Abrera? Okay, yeah, it is actually a very interesting take on the blood compact. Every time I go to Bohol, that's one of the major tourist attractions, and one reason why Boholanos call themselves tongue-in-cheek, the Republic of Bohol. Yeah. Okay. Maybe I could start though. One question, because I read something about Dean Abrera mentioned about the Portuguese coming into Asia and the firing of cannons. No. For example, they went to India and they were not warmly received. They never had a blood compact. No. Is there any other culture around our neighborhood in Asia that had a similar practice of welcoming visitors with a blood compact? Because correct me if I'm wrong, no, I think it's just particular to us. Yeah.
Yes, in Asia, there were really no other accounts. In fact, this is also, Dr. Vallejo, this is also one of the things that's very intriguing that would still need further research, because it was the report of this blood compact was only with the Spaniards. There had been other foreigners who had been coming to the Philippines. The Indians, of course, we have a tremendous record, archaeological and cultural record of Indian influences. Indian influences in the Philippines, and yet there would be no accounts of a blood compact with other groups, only with the Spaniards. So that is one question that we still need to inquire into. Why was there an offer of Sandugo with the Spaniards? Why were this? Because the Chinese were also very meticulous in their record keeping, but there were no accounts. Even in the 13th century, there were no accounts of any group in the Philippines entering into a blood brotherhood. with the Chinese. But with regard to blood oaths, there would be other blood oaths in other parts of the world. In South America, I recall having read one in South America. So the centrality of blood, particularly in agricultural economies, would be really very significant. But in Southeast Asia, it would be us. I am not certain yet whether, because by the 16th century, Islam was already very dominant in Southeast Asia. Perhaps Islam, the entry of Islam in those societies had a significant influence in determining the continuation of a sandugo if it was present in pre-Islamic Southeast Asian societies, or even Confucianism, if it also influenced the eradication of the sandugo. Because in Islamized Philippine areas, like when we already had the Sultanate of Sulu and the Sultanate of Maguindanao, the Islam already forbade the ritual of the sandugo because for religious purposes.
That's a good insight because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think in Islam it's not allowed to mutilate the human body unless
Yes.
it's a conviction for a crime. Yeah. So
Yes.
that was quite surprising because I read some popular history books about the Portuguese coming to Asia, and there was no mention of any.
Correct. Oh, that's true. That's true. But on another note, it's also very important that when Islam, especially the Sultanate of Maguindanao, because in the early 17th century, I think it was 1602, they were still continuing with the traditional raids in the islands because they were raiding. It was something that was really going on all over Southeast Asia, these raids. But very, very, very interestingly, it was the Muslims from the Sultanate of Maguindanao who offered a sandugo with the Datus of Leyte in order for them to be allies against the Spaniards. So they were really going back to traditional cultural practices in order to address a political threat that they saw as growing in their midst. So that was very significant because they were already Muslims, and yet it was they who offered that sandugo. Kaya lang it did not materialize.
It's very interesting that Islam in Asia, especially in the Philippines, is willing to take in the earlier traditions. Okay, we have a question from Dr. Abella here, and should be interesting for this coming election season that we have. No, sometimes I wish I could see all the candidates doing a sandugo. This is a question from Dr. Gelia Patri Abella. How can we use our history in reforming our nation now that we are facing different challenges and with the upcoming election?
Yes, it's really very interesting that, and it's also imperative that we should go back to interpreting our history from our own perspective, because history is always, of course, it's the study of the past events being interpreted according to the present, according to the questions of the present. Like, this is a very important question. We are facing a challenge now, and that challenge leads to our future. the future of the country, how can we use our history? So, for example, it's very important. We look back and see what were the qualities of leaders in our in our not only in pre-colonial society, but in Philippine society, what were the qualities of people whom we held up as models, whom we held up as heroes and heroines? Because it is very important that the sensitivity of the Filipino will always come out. It's also important that we go back to our own traditions and to our own interpretations, because for example, a very very simple example would be when we say a hero in the English language, it has no cultural or emotional resonance in us. But when we say bayani, so it has no gender. It's a bayani is either male or female. But when we say bayani, the root word is always bayan. So therefore, it is already embedded in that concept of bayani that your actions, your motivations are always for the bayan. It is not towards the self. It is always towards the common good. So that is a very simple but very important concept that we have in our culture, embedded in our language.
Thank you, Dean Det. I think we have room for maybe one or two questions from our attendees for the session. You can put it in the chat box. Okay. So if you have other questions, or if not, thank you, Dean Det, and I will call the next speaker. Um, our next speaker is Dr. Jennifer S. Oreta from the Ateneo de Manila University, and this is really very relevant, especially for our this coming political contests that we have now. Her paper is on violent armed conflicts, compounding the hazards of vulnerabilities in the Philippines. So, Dr. Oreta, the floor is yours. Please share your slides.
Thank you very much. Let me. Can you now see my screen?
Yes, yes.
All right. So this paper actually is co-authored by Dr. Professor Andres Oreta of the De La Salle University. So we looked into the hazard vulnerability and how the violent armed conflicts are actually compounding the situation. So the presentation is divided into four points. We begin our discussion on the argument and the context of the paper, and then we zero in on the experience in typhoons Yolanda and Pablo, and then we have some observations and then move on to the issues and challenges. So basically, we have three major arguments. No? The first one is that the vulnerability to hazards and disasters are actually more pronounced, no, in conflict-affected area, and therefore the dynamics of peace and conflict in these areas must be understood in order to ensure that the response is appropriate, relevant, and people-centered. No? The second argument is that the fact that reducing vulnerability, which is a disaster risk reduction strategy, is a very political exercise. So it requires policy, resources, it requires strategic plan, it requires collaboration and convergence, because a state-centered approach only marginalizes the most affected or the most vulnerable sector. The third and vulnerability here, just to borrow the definition by the UN the UNISDR, no, of 2015, there are various types of vulnerability, and vulnerability basically is the susceptibility, no, by the physical, social, and economic environmental factors. No? So in Filipino, it is sometimes translated to kahinaan. So the third argument basically is an attempt, no, to present a framework. No? So we argue that the ideal framework basically is the interface of development, DRRM, and armed conflict. Now, usually what we have right now is what we have right now basically is a combination either of development and DRRM, that is S1, or a combination of disaster response in conflict affected area, which is S2. No? The intersection of the RRM and the armed conflict is where we find S2, or development and armed conflict. But what we are arguing is that the ideal scenario, or the ideal framework, is where we integrate, no, strategically, the policies on development on DRRM, as well as in armed conflict, or addressing armed conflict. The context of the discussion is the Philippines, as I've mentioned earlier, and the Philippines has been regarded as one of the most hazard-prone country in the world. No, so we have earthquakes, we have volcanic eruption, we have flood, we have landslides, we have storm surge, we have typhoons. No, sometimes we joke around that you name it, we actually have it in the Philippines. And when disasters hit, there is always damage to properties, agriculture, infrastructure. There's always physical injury and displacement of people. But at the same time that we are very prone to disasters, we also have a lot of communities that are affected by armed conflict. No, and when we say they are affected by armed conflict, it means that there are violent armed groups that are situated, or that are initiating activities, no, especially in the geographically isolated and depressed areas, no, and the presence of these armed groups actually impede development, and during times of disaster complicate further, no, the DRRM processes. So when a disaster hit, no, armed conflict areas, the impact is actually compounded exponentially, no, in terms of cost, in terms of psychological and social impact on the people, in terms of the capacity of the bureaucracy, no, in managing or addressing the disaster vulnerability. It also affects the cohesion of response, no, both on the provincial and regional level. So as I've said earlier, we will be looking at briefly, no, we are not going to dive so deep on the issue of Pablo and Yolanda, but we selected these two typhoons because Pablo and Yolanda that occurred in 2012 and 2013 respectively affected areas that are also called strongholds of the New People's Army, no, or the NPA. No, so they significantly damage areas in Davao Oriental, Compostela Valley, Eastern and Western Samar, and these are hotbeds, or these are areas that are affected by the presence of the New People's Army. So just moving on to the second part of the discussion, let's look at the Typhoon Pablo. No, it affected the Caraga region. Now here is a quick quick look of the risk profile of the Caraga region. So it has 1.9 million hectares of land, no, and it is characterized by the overlapping patterns of ownership, no, and land rights, no. More than 80% of the 71 municipalities, no, in the area are in coastal zones. There exists, no, a formal and informal economy. So illegal logging, mining, drugs, and other illegal activities are coexisting with formal economic activities. No? And as I've said earlier, the Caraga area, including the neighboring Compostela Valley, are also hotbeds, no, or the strongholds of the New People's Army, no, and the NPA in the areas are actually, or the strength of the NPA in the areas are actually rooted on the issue of contested land rights. No, so the Caraga area is also home to a lot of indigenous communities. No, and there are a lot of questions and a lot of challenges with regard the ancestral domain no issue. So the Regalian doctrine introduced by the Spaniards and the Torrens system applied by the Americans, in a sense, shaped the new institution of land ownership in the area. No, so the IPRA law, no, that was legislated in 1997 came belatedly, no, and the IPRA law that defines the ancestral domain of IP communities or indigenous communities are having is in a sense facing a lot of difficulties because of the land structure, no, the land ownership structure that has already been in place, no, prior to the legislation of the IPRA law. So when typhoon, so these are the reasons why the NPA, no, are in a sense, or these are the issues that are being used by the NPA, no, they are capitalizing on these issues, hence they are strong in the area, no, in the Caraga area. So when Typhoon Pablo hit, no, again, these are just some basic information, 5.3 million affected, 213,000 evacuees no, in the area, and it affected 10 regions, no, causing uh, more than 1,000 deaths, no, displacing more than 200,000 families, no, and 36 billion or 37, almost 37 billion in economic damages. So the typhoon hit Davao Oriental and Compostela Valley in Eastern Mindanao. No? So because this is also where the NPAs no, are situated, the sudden loss of food and supplies in Compostela Valley and Davao region induced the relocation of the NPA guerrilla to the Caraga, no, to the Caraga area. No? And hence, the effect is that there was a surge of NPA activities during the first half no, of 2013. It also increased the tension in the area. No? Because of the movement of the NPA, the military also followed. So there was a lot of military activity, especially in the western bank of Agusan River Basin, in the municipalities of Loreto, Esperanza, and San Luis. So some observations in the typhoon. The typhoon hit areas that were already affected by the presence of armed groups. And these areas are also affected by the economic repercussion no, of having armed conflict no, in the area. The inadequate and poorly planned and executed disaster response created more tension among local government units, and this was again used no, by the underground movement as an opportunity to radicalize dissent. The poor and inadequate recovery construction and the slow pace of assistance created conflict between the affected populations and the government, and especially in conflict-affected areas, the delivery of services, the delivery of assistance was greatly affected by the security situation. Moving on to Yolanda, that happened in 2013. Again, just basic information. 3.4 million families were affected. More than 6,000 are reported dead, and more than 1,000 were reported missing. 12 billion damage to infrastructure, 58 billion damage, social cost and cross-sectoral damage, 25 billion damage to agriculture. No, more than 1 million houses were damaged. So similar to Pablo, the Typhoon Yolanda also affected areas that are considered as conflict affected. No? So in Leyte, the municipalities of Carigara, Haro, Ormoc, Dagami, and Burauen were also classified no, by the military as conflict affected area. In Western Samar, Dabasay, Santa Rita, and Villarreal. In Eastern Samar, Hernani, MacArthur, and Llorente. What we did basically is just zero in on one municipality as a case study, no? Carigara, no? The municipality of Carigara is a second class municipality with 11,000 families or 47,000 population. So the entire population was affected by the typhoon. and all houses no were damaged. No, all houses were damaged. No, uh, health centers, all 49 health centers and 49 daycare centers and 31 elementary schools were also no damaged. No, thankfully water were normalized immediately, but all the rest no were damaged. No, so the estimate damage to livelihood was also 108 million. And there was also a report no immediately after the typhoon, because a lot of the areas affected by the typhoon also or the mountainous areas of no that was affected by the typhoon were also the uh, the camps no of the NPA. There were reports no of the NPA getting no the supplies that were supposed to be delivered to the community. So there was a documentary by the GMA saying that the NPAs actually attempted no they fired on the Red Cross convoy going to Carigara. So Carigara, as well as the other affected areas, were actually included in the priority municipality of the NDRRMC. No? So they were provided social development and security intervention and immediate assistance, no? Disaster recovery activities, no? Like cash for work were also used by the government no? And some civil society organization as an entry point to engage the people. So this is the example no these are the interventions no provided by the government at the time no immediately after the typhoon. So as I've said, social protection, development no and security interventions were provided immediately by the government. Now, what were the problems encountered? No, the disaster relief and recovery process no became highly politicized. No, there was also a massive debate no on whether or not to use the international standards, which was being pushed forward by the international groups no that were providing help no versus the local response that is actually based on experience, based on the legal framework, and based on government protocols or government systems. There's a lot of question on whether or not the distribution of assistance was fair. No, so a lot of communities, especially those that are not provided immediate assistance, were questioning on whether or not there's favoritism no in the delivery or in the distribution of assistance. And then there was also a lot of discussion about resilience. No, it was actually people were celebrating the resilience of the people of communities, but take note that this resilience coexists alongside deep discontent no versus the government because of many broken promises or unfulfilled promises. So some lessons learned, particularly in Yolanda, the government support no per community should have been more synchronized to produce maximum impact. No, the problem actually with government is that when they deliver services, no, it's not they are not work most of the time they are working in silos no that's compartmentalized no but in a situation like the communities affected by typhoons like Yolanda and Pablo, it is necessary that there is synchronized approach or convergence approach. Next, there has to be a strategic communication plan that would accompany the synchronized service delivery. And this messaging should be carefully crafted according to the target audience. The political and international work should also should have been done also more carefully to ensure that the international aid will really go to communities that are most affected and most vulnerable. Also, this political and international work can also prevent the channeling of funds no to the underground movement. There were reports no during the time of Yolanda. There were unconfirmed no and unofficial reports saying that some of the international money no, are being diverted by some NGOs, no, in the underground movement, no. So as I've said, these are unofficial and unverified, no, report, no, and therefore political and international work should have been done to ensure that that the aid would really go to the communities that really need them. Now, some observations regarding the conflict and disaster interface, no, when people are displaced because of the combined effects of disaster and armed conflict, when they return back to their communities, they are confronted with the pre-existing security condition. So the existing security realities of their home environment will welcome them when they return, no, after being displaced, no. So this will further reinforce the insecurity of the affected people. And the response is either some of them would seek legal remedy, but others might rely on insurgent groups, or others will directly arm themselves. Second observation, it further disaster and conflict, no, in the interface of the two, further intensified the suffering of people, and it stretches the capability and the coping mechanisms of the local government units and exacerbate further the poverty level of people, no. So it can hinder the disaster recovery, rehabilitation, and risk reduction effort. It can also divert the attention of policy decision makers away from DRR issues, no? The overlap of disaster and armed conflict also increases the vulnerability and burden of women, no? And it can also increase gender-based violence, no? For example, in situations of conflict, there is always, or the DSWD would always monitor an increase in the reports of trafficking, no? Trafficking of persons. So the third observation is that the not just the typhoons Pablo and Yolanda, but the various typhoons that we have experienced created the necessity to recraft, no, the DRRM approach of the government. So RA 10121, no, was legislated, and this Republic Act shifted the approach of the government from reactive to proactive, no. So here you will see the 4 DRRM priorities, no, the prevention and mitigation, preparedness, response, and rehabilitation and recovery, with the objective of creating a safer, adaptive, and resilient community. So what are the key features of the RA 10121? It adopts a bottom-up and participatory disaster risk reduction approach. Disasters now are treated as a reflection of people's vulnerability rather than a function of physical hazard, and an integrated approach, no, or what they call the whole of government approach, no, is now being used um, uh, to towards genuine social and human development intervention. So it is now being adopted, no. So the basic challenge really is, how do we reduce the impact of violent armed conflict so that we can build a safer, more resilient community to natural hazards. So the key question and the key problem really is, how do we ensure that the root causes, the pressures, no, are addressed, no, in order to achieve a safer condition uh, that will mitigate, no, if not address, no, or if not address the issue of hazards. Now, this is the last part of our discussion, no? So what are the issues and challenges? What are the issues that confront us, no, in terms of addressing the dual vulnerability of disaster and armed conflict? The first is the convergence of the national and local efforts. No? There are a lot of complicated authority and coordination lines. We have too many operational units, and this creates a disjointed program and policy response. There are a lot of problems in coordination between national and local operation. There is no coherent and cohesive accountability lines and coordination mechanism. there is a tendency for the government to treat issues based on compartmentalized and specialized issues instead of treating them as cohesive and integrated. No? So solutions are most often too focused and myopic, and it tends to create problems on other areas. No? So it addresses one problem, but it creates another problem. The level of understanding and appreciation of the national bureaucracy with regard the nexus of disaster, armed conflict, and development is low. In general, the personnel, especially in the national government agencies, have cursory knowledge and appreciation on the gravity of the problem in the community level. So the sense of urgency is low, and therefore, the local government units that are affected are left in the forefront of problem solving and direct action intervention. The lack of a strategic DRRM action plan, especially in conflict-affected area, is also a problem. Without a cohesive plan, LGUs and security forces are left to do ad hoc and stopgap arrangements. The security forces, the military and the police, are used as first responders during times of disaster. But if the area is also conflict affected, then you are stretching the capacity and capability of the security forces. Because on the one hand, they are addressing the armed groups, but on the other hand, they are also expected to be the first responders during times of disaster. And finally, the lack of access road and infrastructure in some provinces leave areas in relative isolation. And hence, it creates safe havens and recruitment hubs for armed groups or extremist groups. And this isolation of and the isolation of these communities and the lack of government mechanism in this area greatly contribute in the difficulty of rehabilitation and recovery. So that ends this presentation. I apologize that we extended a few minutes. So we are now open for questions and comments. Dr. Andres Oreta is also with us, so he can help me in answering some of the questions.
Thank you, Dr. Oreta, for that interesting presentation. If you have questions, please put it in the chat box. Are there any questions? Maybe I can ask our co-host, Dean Det. Do you have a question for Dr. Oreta?
Yes, thank you very much for a very enlightening and eye-opening presentation. How would local governments be able to efficiently respond to disasters happening in their area without the pitfalls of unfortunately aiding the groups that actually want to undermine government? What would there be like parameters by which they can select the NGOs, for example? I am not really certain because of course, I come from a province that Albay that that's always affected by typhoons and volcanic eruptions, and we also have a very persistent insurgency problem, and it's really
a perennial
there's
problem.
really a connection between disaster and insurgency. So yes, it's a very vexing question.
In the international literature, there is what we call the community policing. The community policing actually is an integration of the local government, the police, and the community. No, and the idea of the community policing is that these three groups become co-responsible in the safety of their area. No, and when I say safety, I'm actually expanding the definition. It's not just the physical safety, but also safety during times of disaster. No, so the Philippine National Police actually has initiated the community and service oriented policing, which is really an adoption of this literature on community policing. Unfortunately, it is not being fully implemented. No, it was initiated during the previous administration, but because the police right now is so involved in the war on drugs, this
Mm-mm.
kind of intervention was shelved. But this was a very promising effort on the part of the DILG, because you now bring together, the relevant stakeholders in promoting, the issue of safety in the area. I think that is the key. No, the
Mm-mm.
problem always, or the solution always, is inclusivity, ensuring that people, especially in the most vulnerable areas, are consulted and informed, no, about the government programs, and the community also must have a clear channel, no, to the local government, so that they can raise the issues, no, or they have a platform where they can air their grievance, or they can bring up, no, to the issues to the attention of the government.
Okay. Thank you. Can I have another question, Dr. Vallejo?
Yes, then I'll follow with
Oh,
something
oh,
related to your question, Dean Det.
oo. Yes, kasi it's really yun nga, it's really a a problem also. Insurgency is also a problem of livelihood, and livelihood is also connected to the disasters in the province. So I was interested in what you mentioned, Dr. Oreta, about the proactive measures that were being taken by government. What about the measures to improve livelihood and economic life of the people in relation to the disasters that always visit particular provinces?
Mm, well, 2 points. No, the first is that during the time of President Arroyo, we initiated the One Town One product, the
Yes,
OTO,
yes.
OTOP, hindi ba? The
Uh-uh.
problem is that the raw materials in a lot of the areas are the same. So the kind of products that they produce are also the same. So that whole notion of comparative advantage based on the one town one product dissipated, precisely because the quality control is. So in
Uh-huh.
other words, in terms of livelihood, we need to invest more on research and development, no, on what we can
Uh-huh.
do vis-a-vis the raw materials that are available in the various areas, no. So that's one, no, research and development. Second is access, no, and mobility. A lot of these areas are also geographically isolated areas, no.
Uh-huh.
So there's no access road, no. So what the local government must do is to ensure that the tributary roads are connected to the national roads, so that you decrease the cost, no, of bringing the goods, no, to the market, no, and you also facilitate, no, the mobility of people, no. However, there are we thought that I worked in the government during the Pinoy administration, no, and one of the projects that we did, especially in the Caraga area, is to look into the tributary roads, no. So
Mm-mm.
before we left the government, we created, a comprehensive map, particularly in the Surigao area, on how we can connect the IP communities, no, to the mainstream, no. So we did a lot of consultation in the IP communities in the local areas, and we completed, no, somehow, no, and the cost was about 6 billion, no, for creating the roads. But when we presented it, no, NEDA called our attention, no, and said, these roads that you have created, our context when we were creating the roads was mobility, no, and
Mm.
security. But when NEDA saw it, they said, you will be opening the hardwood forest, no, when you create these roads.
Mm.
Mhm.
And therefore, it has an impact on the long-term sustainable development. So, and again, I go back to the issue of convergence. So sometimes we think that we are solving the problem, no, and we thought that we solved the problem by creating all these comprehensive, map, only to realize that we will be creating another problem if we implement it, no.
Mm.
So it really requires a political will on the part of the government to really work together, no, bring the various agencies, national agencies, as well as the national and the local, to work together. Otherwise, we will keep on talking about these problems because we are always compartmentalized in our response.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Oreta. Okay, for my question, which is actually very connected to Dean Det's earlier questions. When we were more free, which means before the pandemic and you can move around, okay, I had the opportunity to visit that region in Caraga and also Eastern Mindanao, crossing over the mountain and seeing the effect of Pablo,
Mm,
no? And going back to Comval. That's part of some work with food security with a colleague
mm,
of mine teaching STS in UP Diliman. So anyway, also I was able to visit BARM, okay,
mm,
when BARM was newly set up. And this is really my question. I think, personally, I think there are some major advances on disaster resilience and ending armed conflict in the BARM. No? Uh, I talked to some of the BARM officials also. Of course, there are major structural problems still, and also the nature of BARM raising the money for all of these. No, so I'd like to ask Dr. Oreta about this. No, what do you think is the example of having an autonomous or more federal? BARM has a different system of government from the rest of the Philippines. No? Coming up with a more decentralized in the case of BARM. Do you think it will be more effective in developing this resilience and
mm.
ending the insurgencies and armed conflicts? Noting that BARM was set really to as a part of a peace settlement, political settlement.
Okay. Thank you for that question. 2 points, no? The major difference between BARM and Caraga is that in BARM there was a ceasefire between the government and the MILF, and there was a peace agreement, no? In Caraga, the government continues. There's no ceasefire with the NPA. There's no peace agreement with the NPA. So, in other words, in the BARM area, there's in a sense a security stability, no, brought about not just by the ceasefire but also because of the peace agreement. But in the NPA affected areas, because there's no peace agreement, and under this administration, the NPA has been labeled also as a terrorist organization. There is always confrontation, no, armed confrontation between state forces and the NPA. So the security stability is always volatile. So that's why in the BARM area there is more progress, no, particularly in the DRRM. Now, on your question, will federalism address the problem? I will qualify my answer. If federalism, together with an anti-political dynasty's law, is
Okay.
passed, I think it will address. But if it is only federalism absent and there's no component about anti-political dynasty, what we will create simply are little kingdoms, no? Because until now, a lot of our local governments are controlled, no, by oligarchic families, no. So we need to make sure. I am also in favor of federalism, but my caveat is that it has to be in tandem with an anti-political dynasties law, no. And I'm not going to support a federalism law without that component, because we will just be creating more problems, no. Because we will be strengthening the power of political families in the area.
Okay, thank you. now anti-dynasty. That's the thing for the next election. It's always a suntok sa buwan.
Yeah. Oo nga.
Okay, it's very interesting. Unfortunately, we do not have, we could go on and on about, especially looking at Mindanao region that is so very much important to our country and to the rest of Southeast Asia. But we have to leave it at there. So thank you again, Dr. Ureta, for a very enlightening and very eye-opening. I opened my eyes even further because I've been there and now I'm able to connect all the things that I've seen. So thank you again. So we can move on to our next speaker. Our last speaker, unfortunately, our fourth speaker who worked in Sulu. I think this will complement all the previous presentations, can't be here with us. So we will just call our third speaker, Dr. Gelia Patria Abella of the Central Luzon State University, who will give a talk on coastal resource management in the municipality of Masinloc, Zambales, using Gorobi. Masinloc is another familiar place to me. I've been there many times for my research. So Dr. Abella, the floor is yours, and please share your screen.
Hello, good morning, ma'am. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, good evening, America, and magandang umaga, Pilipinas. So, marhay na aldaw sa Indugabos, Bicolanas and Bicolanos. So, I'm going to present just a portion of our study, and I hope I would be able to address one of the concerns of Dr. Ureta. So, the title of our study, can you see my screen now?
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Okay. So the title of our study is Coastal Resources Management Options in the Municipality of Masinloc, Zambales, Philippines, incorporating multi-stakeholders goals and priorities. So with me are Dr. Annie Melinda Paz Alberto, Mr. Zandon Paul M. Cario, and Eman C. Ramos of Central Luzon State University, and Dr. Gerald M. Tubay, and Dr. Felino P. Lansigan, who is in the room, from the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. So coastal resource management is a key approach in achieving the priority development goals in a coastal community. So degradation and depletion of coastal resources are due to overexploitation. So there is a need to develop a decision support system that is based on systems approach to provide coastal resource management options. So in 2018, we have this big program tagged as CRIM-INSEDS, spelled out as Coastal Resource Management, integrating coastal resource valuation, climate change adaptation, and disaster risk reduction in the province of Zambales, a systems approach. So systems approach is looking at the coast in holistic manner, meaning what's happening up there affects down there. So the entire CRIM-INSEDS program revolved around this operation. First is that goals are indeed should be identified by the stakeholders, then followed by the economic valuation of the assessed coastal and terrestrial resources. Disaster risk management or assessment was conducted, and adaptation strategies on climate change were identified. So all the important variables were quantified, and all the quantified data were processed in Gorobi, a multiple goal linear programming software. Outputs are the coastal resource management options as basis of policies and development plans, which will lead hopefully towards the achievement of the goals identified. Now let me tell you about Masinloc. So Masinloc is bounded on the north by the municipality of Candelaria, on the east by the Mount Masinloc, on the south by municipalities of Palawig and Iba, and on the west by Oyon Bay and Masinloc Bay. So Masinloc is just one of the study sites. So out of the 13 villages, 11 are coastal. Masinloc is endowed with different natural resources, particularly fishes, coral reefs, seagrass, we have mangroves, beach forest, and the mountains. So we decided to divide the administrative boundaries of Masinloc, both the land and water, into 1 hectare grid so that it would be more specific. So we did a focus group discussion, and the prioritized development goals of the associations of village captains and the members of the municipal council or the Sangguniang Pangbayan were translated in what we call the objective functions. Okay, so for land use allocation, we have goal 1 to minimize disaster risk. Goal 2 is to minimize lack of adaptive capacity. Goal 3 is to maximize land suitability. And goal 4 is to maximize economic value. The same goes through with the water use allocation, only that we remove the element of adaptive capacity. So based on the study of Project 2 of this program, South Poblacion had the highest average disaster risk score of 1.5. All the areas in South Poblacion are or have moderate flood risk. Again, 100% has moderate tsunami risk and 98% has moderate storm surge risk. Now let's go to the adaptive capacity. The village of Bani had the highest adaptive score of 0.49. So while the rest of the villages had scores ranging from 0.54 to 0.57, falling under moderate. Okay. Project 3 had discussed thoroughly the climate change adaptation strategies being done in Masinloc. So in terms of land suitability, we have the rice with 20% of the agricultural land had moderate suitability for rice, whereas 29% is highly suitable for corn. So if you can see, the one with the colors are the agricultural land of Masinloc, and the one on the right, the white portion, is the mountainous part of Masinloc. Okay, next. For the cowpea, we have 90% of the agricultural land is highly suitable for cowpea. Okay, and almost all our villages have high suitability except for the one in that island, which is San Salvador. Okay. For Amargoso, or our favorite Ampalaya, 39% of the agricultural land is highly suitable for Amargoso. Okay, so next. We have the tomato. 29% of the agricultural land is highly suitable for tomatoes. And you know, Zambales is known for its sweet mango. So on our assessment, 12% is moderately suitable. 12% of the agricultural land is moderately suitable. And 80% is marginally suitable for mangoes. Okay. Next, only 2% of the agricultural land is moderately suitable for built-up, and 80% is marginally suitable for residential and commercial establishments. Okay. In terms of economic value, among the evaluated crops, the highest economic value was 13.2 million pesos from rice production. In 2018, the area planted to rice is only 75 hectares, followed by corn, having 8.7 million pesos planted to 24 hectares. The mango production also had high economic value, yielding 7.3 million pesos. And the cowpea had the lowest economic value of 3.9 million pesos, planted to only 1.5 hectares. However, if you can remember, a large part of the agricultural land is highly suitable for cowpea. So among the land uses, the built-up had the highest economic value of 2.7 billion pesos. Now let's go to the land use allocation by the Gurobi. So this map reveals that optimal land use allocation for the municipality of Masinloc. So large portion is allocated for cowpea with an area of 3,486 hectares because of its high suitability. It is followed by corn with an allocation of 1,553 hectares because of its also high suitability rating and high economic value. Rice production is allocated to 650 hectares, larger than the area planted in 2018. So the sweet variety of mango was assigned to 99 hectares only. So Gurobi allocated 268 hectares for built up and mostly found at Barangay Santo Rosario. Here. All right. Next. So as I've said, this land use allocation would be part of the decision support system or portions or options for coastal resource management. So with the land use allocation, the disaster risk score is minimized to 67. So this implies that the houses were positioned to areas with low disaster risk. The lack of adaptive capacity scores of Masinloc is minimized to 5,820. So this means that people in those areas have adaptive capacity, have high adaptive capacity to flooding. And the land suitability score is maximized to 37,000, whereas the economic value of built-up area would amount to 131.98 billion pesos. Now let's go to the water use allocation. So in terms of disaster risk, the storm surge risk scores of the above villages were adopted in the first 3 grids of the municipal water, ranging from 1 to 2. All right, so most of the villages have disaster risk against storm surge. Okay, so only a very small portion of 0.05% of the remaining municipal water is highly suitable for mangrove, and 0.45% of the municipal water is highly suitable for coral reef. Okay, and then next. Only 0.05% is highly suitable for mangrove. Yes, I'm done with that. So 0.44% is highly suitable for seagrass, and a higher percent, just a little above, is 5.62% of the remaining municipal water is highly suitable to fish cage. And then for marine protected area, only 1.98% of the remaining municipal water is highly suitable for marine protected areas. So in terms of economic value, the highest economic value comes from the marine protected area of 10 million pesos per hectare. So it is followed by mangrove with economic value of 9 million pesos per hectare and fish cage having 2 million pesos per hectare. Okay, so this is the water use allocation provided by Gurobi. So the largest area allocated by Gurobi is the municipal fishing area with 10,736 hectares. This is attributed to high suitability to almost all the municipal water, and it entails no rehabilitation cost. So the coral reef receives only 1 hectare in addition to the existing coral reef of 747 hectares. This can be attributed to the high cost of the rehabilitation of coral reefs, amounting to 100,000 pesos or more per hectare. Then the allocation for mangrove is 37 hectares. Okay, and if you would notice, these are positioned along the shore to minimize the effects of storm surge in these areas. This is in addition to the existing mangrove of 261 hectares. The seagrass is allocated to 1 hectare only, in addition to the 111 existing seagrass in the area. So this is due to its low suitability upon our assessment. So we can say that there is an optimal water use allocation in the municipal water of Masinloc. So the use of mangrove is maximized since it is positioned to the areas where it can minimize the effects of storm surge, canceling out the risk score. So the water suitability is maximized to 22,406, meaning Gurobi allocated the water uses where they have high water suitability rating. The economic value of 52 billion pesos may be attained with the water use allocation provided by Gurobi, with the municipal fishing area giving the highest contribution. So in conclusion, we can say that there is really an optimal land and water use allocation using Gurobi, a mathematical optimization solver, which is based on suitability, economic value, disaster risk, and adaptive capacity. So the optimum allocation of uses means lesser inputs in its production and or operation. Thus, it can be ensured that maximum benefits would be obtained, meaning higher yields and lesser environmental impacts. Land use allocation also consider the welfare of the people according to their respective disaster risk level and their adaptive capacity. So this study recommends that the land and water use allocation provided by Gurobi be the basis on the formulation or updating of the comprehensive land use plan, not only in Masinloc, but hopefully in the entire local government units of the Philippines. And we would like to thank the Commission on Higher Education for generously funding our project, the local government unit of Masinloc and their stakeholders for participating in this study. So we are now open for questions, and Dr. Felino Lansigan is in the room to help me answer the question. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you, Dr. Abella, for that very interesting presentation of Masinloc being very familiar to me, and from the presentation, I get new insights on what's happening in that municipality. Perhaps I could ask the first question. No? Okay, then there are other questions also. Maybe to start the ball rolling for the questions on your presentation, I know that Masinloc is known to a lot of people for its tourism attractions like the beach. Okay, in your land use plan, your land use assessments, did you identify the risk to these potential tourist sites, especially impacts on the marine environment? And also, and I'm asking this because one of the key priorities once we get out of COVID-19 is to boost domestic tourism. And I think Masinloc will welcome a lot of domestic and international tourists.
Yes, sir. In terms of disaster risk, we have four hazards. We just computed for the carrying capacity, but that we were not able to include in our model.
Okay.
But in terms of disaster risk, the four hazards were considered.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, let me read a question from the chat box from Mr. Marvin J. Genuguin. Okay. How did you compute the suitability per parameter such as adaptive capacity, land use, and water use, etc.?
Yeah, it's a very data-intensive research. So in terms of suitability, we separated the land suitability. So we made use of the Food and Agriculture Organization method in land evaluation, whereas in terms of water suitability, we made use of different literatures available in the net. And we have really, this is a very data intensive. So we really purchased data from the Blue Nomads. It's a non-government organization. Yeah. So we have different parameters to measure the suitability of both the land and water. In terms of adaptive capacity, we also did a household survey, and we made use of the available questionnaire that was used by previous authors.
Are there any other questions from our audience? Dean Det, do you have a question? Okay. Marvin has put his thumbs up. So Dean Det, do you have a question for Dr. Abella?
I'm not sure if this would be part actually of your presentation, Dr. Abella, but this morning I was just reading about the problem of the corals. I think the coral bleaching, I think it was being called coral bleaching. is that also present in the area that you studied, and what are the efforts? Because I realized that it's related to climate change. So what are the efforts really, not only probably in Masinloc, but in other parts of the country? What can we do about about that issue?
Yes, but the corals, the destruction of corals in Masinloc or in that part of the northern part of Zambales, it's not more on due to coral bleaching, but on the anthropogenic activities.
Mm.
So if I may mention, the mine tailings that were um, uh, disposed there during the active mining activities in the area
Oh.
really put a threat on the coral reefs. And but in fairness, the municipality of Masinloc has this coastal resource management office that really take efforts in the rehabilitation of the corals.
Mm-mm.
Okay, thank you. And I have a question again. Okay, this is
Sure.
about mango. Okay, no, I just remembered that I had a graduate student in environmental science who was modeling the potential effects of climate change on mangoes in the country. And essentially all the mango producing regions are at risk, especially like Guimaras, which is the main competitor for Zambales mangoes.
Zambales, yes.
Yeah. So my question is, because you showed that very limited yung suitability for mango growing in ano, would you say that Masinloc and probably by extension the rest of the province is really at risk of its mango production will eventually lessen, and so it will be a problem for the economy of the province and the town?
Probably we were just surprised that the suitability for mango was just that small. But in terms of high suitability, but it is wide in wide range in terms of moderate suitability. So, but we did not take a look at the effects of climate change in the future in terms of the suitability of mangoes. So, but we have a proposal to really look into that.
Mm.
So that would be a next study for us.
Yeah, I think I could link you up with my former grad student if he is still interested in
Yes,
in this
please.
kind of work. Yeah, that's why I was quite surprised. This is suitability. I always thought that Guimaras as by proportion as a higher suitability. Guimaras province, no, but that's a known the mango island nga tawag dun eh. But I was quite surprised about the suitability statistics that you have computed. And I think that would be important in assessing, or similar approaches in assessing yung effects of climate changes on our very so-called cash crops. Yeah. Okay, are there other questions? Time check, it's 11:42. Okay. I think we just have enough time. So we have time for questions pa. Okay, if there are people who can ask, can put it in the chat box. Okay, if not, perhaps I could summarize our session. Okay. So thank you, Dr. Abella. Hoping to see you again about doing all this. I'll link you with my grad student, my former grad student. Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So we don't our last speaker is unable to join us today, but and that's quite unfortunate because she worked in a region of Barm, which is Holo. Hopefully next time she can present this her paper. So for now, I think it's about time for me to summarize the session that we had, which is actually very interesting. Our session is about it's actually a huge range, education to media, museology, and indigenous knowledge. I also moderated last year's presentation, and we focused more on the museum and heritage aspects. But for this year, and this is quite good, that we focus on our history, especially in indigenous knowledge. Dean Abrera, in her paper on the Sandugo, actually gives us new insights on how the framing of the whole historical event is, with the Ilustrados keeping it within a typical legal and contractual framework between two equal powers, okay, the Europeans and the people of the islands at that time, because we had no nation state yet. And that was part of the narrative of imagining our Filipino nation, the Ilustrados. However, as what Dean Abrera pointed out, the narrative of the Sandugoan, it was transformed by Bonifacio by really focusing on not just a contractual breaking of reneging of a contract between two equal powers, but more of a moral issue between the colonizing Spaniards and the Filipinos. And so our people decided to embark on a nationalist revolution that eventually separated us from the colonial powers. Of course, that would much relate to our second speaker. Okay, the revolution in the Sandugo and the Ilustrados are separated from us by time by more than maybe around 130 to 140 years. No? And the next speaker, Dr. Oreta, focused on disaster resilience and also the very thorny problem which we have not yet completely resolved, armed conflict and insurgency in these areas, and how disasters tend to magnify or displace people, making the solutions more complex. However, it's not a total hopeless solution. There are approaches to doing that, and our second speaker told us about community policing, but political exigencies by the different presidential administrations may put that in the back burner, and perhaps that is something that future governments in the country would have to consider because it's promising. Also, I think our second speaker also reacted to my question on the effectiveness of a federalized system, and she gave her thoughts about it, that we can have a federal system, but we should have also an anti-dynasty, family dynasty bill, okay, something that's quite very hard, if that's going to pass through our political system. And our last speaker dealt with the classification of land using algorithms for remote sensing, and which gives us new insights on a municipality's land use, especially the risks. And also this municipality is also towards urbanizing. I think we can note that from the values of real estate in the town, and the hazards and what could be done to minimize the hazards, to make the town of Masinloc, and probably by extension the whole province of Zambales, more resilient to changes, so that the benefits of development would be more equitably distributed to the citizens of Masinloc and also the citizens of the province of Zambales. So we have three papers which span huge amount of time in history, okay? From the time of the birth of our national identity to the time that we have now, in which we're solving all the problems that face our country. Okay? And I think that is a good, all of these will give us good insights for the coming political exercises, the national elections. So for our colleagues here in the Philippines, please go out and vote. And for our colleagues in the US, if you are registered as an overseas voter, please vote, because the country's future and all of these things, having peace and development in our conflict affected areas, also in our areas that are affected by a lot of environmental change. Whoever we vote into office will mean a lot to the solutions of these problems or challenges. I think they're not really, they're more of challenges really. So again, so thank you for all who attended the REC 14 today, this Sunday. I know it's a Sunday morning, and for most of you, including me, Sunday mornings are supposed to be more of a relaxation or do the housework or do your house chores, no? But thank you for attending. And for our colleagues in the Western Hemisphere, I know it's Saturday night, and most of our colleagues have attended the PAASE sessions earlier in the day. Perhaps you're tired. So thank you again for attending or listening in through the live feed, our REC 14 session. Okay. So with that, I would close the session now, and I'd like to thank my co-hosts, co-moderator, Dean Det Abrera. I also like to thank the DLSU technical team because from my end, I have difficulty accessing my own university server. Maybe it's my internet connection. So I asked for a backup, which is De La Salle. So thank you, De La Salle technical team for providing the support for REC 14. Okay, thank you again, and I wish you a pleasant day ahead for people here in the Philippines. It's Sunday. A pleasant Sunday to all, and for those in the Western Hemisphere, US and Canada, a pleasant evening and Saturday night for all. So thank you again, and please keep safe. The pandemic is still with us. Okay, although we're exiting the pandemic, we have to even be more careful of our health precautions. So thank you again, and good day.
Thank you.